The world is burning and Europe trembles under the shadow of war. For 5 long years, the Wehrmacht had stormed across the continent, leaving behind cities reduced to rubble and millions of lives shattered. But now, in the heart of the Soviet Union, the tide has turned. The Red Army has pushed the once invincible German war machine back from the gates of Moscow, back from the ashes of Stalingrad, and now toward the final reckoning. Yet what happened in Moscow on July 17, 1944, was unlike any battlefield victory. It was not fought with guns, tanks, or artillery, but with silence, humiliation, and the crushing weight of symbolism. On that summer day, as the morning sun rose over Moscow, more than 57,000 captured German soldiers were brought into the Soviet capital. They were not brought for trial. They were not brought for execution. They were brought for a parade, a procession not of pride, but of punishment. A spectacle so staggering, so calculated, that its images would burn into history as one of the most chilling demonstrations of psychological warfare ever staged. The streets of Moscow filled with ordinary Soviet citizens, workers, mothers, widows, and soldiers scarred by war. They had seen their homes destroyed, their families torn apart, and now they watched as their enemies, those who had once thought themselves untouchable, marched in defeat. Step by step, boot after boot, the broken army of Hitler was displayed before the very people whose destruction they had once sworn to achieve. This was not just a parade. This was a statement to the world that Nazi Germany could bleed, could falter, and could be brought low before the eyes of millions. This was Moscow's shocking spectacle, the day humiliation marched on cobblestone. The morning of July 17, 1944, broke with a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Moscow was not a city unaccustomed to noise, factory sirens, distant rumblings of troop movements, the endless clamor of rebuilding after years of war. But on this day, an unspoken anticipation hovered above the capital, hanging in the air like fog. Families had risen early, mothers clasping the hands of children too young to understand the magnitude of what they were about to see. Old men shuffled toward the streets, their faces carved with the lines of sorrow, of hunger, of grief carried since the first shells had fallen 3 years earlier. Soldiers in worn uniforms took their places among the crowd, some leaning on crutches, some with bandages still fresh from the front. They were united not in celebration, not in joy, but in a solemn, heavy expectation, and then they came. From behind the wide boulevards of Moscow, the first lines of captured German soldiers appeared. They did not march with the proud, mechanical precision that had once terrified Europe. They stumbled, they dragged their boots, they moved as if the very act of walking was an unbearable weight. These were not the men who had roared through Warsaw, Paris, or Kiev with steel confidence and burning arrogance. These were the same men, but stripped of every illusion of invincibility. Their uniforms were torn, their caps crooked, their faces gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. Dust clung to their boots, grime streaked their cheeks, and their hollow eyes stared not at the watching crowds, but somewhere beyond, into nothingness. The Soviet citizens did not clap. They did not shout insults. There were no thrown stones or jeers. Instead, there was silence. A silence so deep, it pressed down on the soldiers like a physical force. For years, the people of Moscow had endured the nightmare of bombings, starvation, and loss. For years, the shadow of the Wehrmacht had loomed over their very existence. And now, as they looked upon the very men who had been the embodiment of that terror, they gave them nothing. No recognition, no engagement, only the quiet, cold gaze of a people who had survived hell and refused to grant their enemies even the dignity of attention. The prisoners were arranged in columns, stretching for miles. Nearly 2 full armies of men reduced to shadows of themselves. Every step they took was deliberate, not because they wished to march, but because NKVD guards at their flanks ensured they did not falter. Still, some stumbled, knees buckling from weakness. Others leaned against their comrades, dragging themselves forward. But there was no pause, no respite. The endless human river flowed through the streets, a grim spectacle without music, without fanfare, without banners. Only boots striking stone, and the steady breath of thousands moving in reluctant unison. Among the crowds, survivors of German atrocities stood shoulder to shoulder. A mother who had buried her child in the rubble of Stalingrad. A widow who had watched her husband march off to defend Moscow and never return. A boy, barely 12, whose eyes were already hardened by war, stared unblinking at the once proud soldiers who had burned his village. For these people, the sight before them was not merely a parade of prisoners, it was a reckoning. They did not see soldiers anymore. They saw murderers, looters, invaders who had promised to enslave their homeland. Yet as they gazed upon the prisoners' bent heads and weary faces, there was no triumph. Only the bitter acknowledgement of shared humanity and the deep, aching question of why so many lives had been torn apart. For the German soldiers, humiliation was etched into every step. They had been raised on visions of Aryan superiority, of invincibility, of destiny carved by Hitler's words. They had stormed into the Soviet Union with songs on their lips and arrogance in their stride. They had believed themselves to be masters of the East, destined to trample Slavic lands beneath their boots. But now, here in the heart of Moscow, they were stripped bare of those illusions. There were no banners, no Führer's speeches, no cheering crowds. Only the quiet judgment of the people they had failed to conquer. Each face in the crowd was a mirror of their defeat, each silent stare a blade cutting deeper than bullets. The silence was calculated. Stalin had ordered that there should be no jeering, no demonstrations of anger, no mob violence. Instead, he wanted silence, cold, merciless silence that would suffocate the German soldiers more effectively than words. And so, as they passed Red Square, their footsteps rang louder than cannon fire. In the stillness of Moscow, each sound became a drumbeat of humiliation, boot after boot, step after step, a march into infamy. The Soviet people understood their role. They did not shout because they did not need to. Their silence spoke louder than any insult. It said, "You are nothing. You are dust." To those watching from afar, the scene was unforgettable. Foreign journalists scribbled frantic notes, struggling to capture the magnitude of what they saw. Here was the army that had terrified Europe, that had once seemed unstoppable, now reduced to a sea of broken men paraded through the streets of their enemy's capital. No one needed to explain the symbolism. It was written in every bowed head, every hollow stare, every dragging boot. The mighty Wehrmacht, once the terror of the continent, was now a defeated procession of ghosts. The Soviet people, hardened by years of suffering, absorbed the moment with quiet gravity. Some clenched their fists, not out of rage but out of memory, remembering loved ones lost to the invaders. Others let tears fall silently down their cheeks, not of pity for the prisoners, but of release, of catharsis after years of unrelenting pain. And for the children who stood wide-eyed along the streets, it was a lesson they would never forget, that the enemy, no matter how powerful, could be broken. That survival itself was a kind of victory. The march went on for nearly 2 hours. Endless columns of prisoners shuffled forward, their numbers so vast it seemed as though the river of men would never end. The sun beat down mercilessly, baking the cobblestones, soaking their uniforms in sweat. Some stumbled and fell, but were forced back to their feet. Others stared blankly at the horizon, as though they could will themselves out of this nightmare. And all the while Moscow watched. Not with laughter, not with cruelty, but with the quiet satisfaction of a city that had survived. It was not triumph they felt, but something deeper, something heavier. It was the weight of justice, not the kind delivered by courts, but the kind written in the turning of history. This was not a day of joy. It was a day of reckoning, of seeing the invincible made vulnerable, the conquerors conquered. For the German soldiers, every step was a reminder of their downfall. For the Soviet people, every passing face was a reminder of their own resilience. And for history, it was a moment when silence spoke louder than war itself. Under the scorching sun of July 1944, the endless human columns that poured through Moscow streets were not an accident of war, nor merely the byproduct of Red Army victories. This was theater, carefully orchestrated, meticulously designed, and dripping with symbolism at every turn. Behind the spectacle stood one man, Joseph Stalin. To the Soviet leader, war was not only fought with tanks, artillery, and infantry, but with images, silence, and the bending of memory. The march of 57,000 German prisoners was not a mere humiliation of the enemy. It was a weapon, sharpened with the precision of propaganda aimed at the hearts and minds of both his people and the watching world. Stalin knew better than anyone that perception shaped reality. In 1941, when German armies had stood at the gates of Moscow, he had stayed in the city against the advice of his generals. His presence alone had become a rallying cry for the nation, a symbol that the Soviet Union would not collapse under pressure. 3 years later, the balance of power had shifted. The Red Army had bled the Wehrmacht dry in the fields of Kursk, Stalingrad, and Smolensk. Thousands of villages had been liberated, and yet victory was still incomplete. Hitler remained in Berlin, his propaganda still blaring, his armies still fighting. Stalin's challenge was not only to win the war, but to convince the world, his people, his allies, and even his enemies, that Nazi Germany was already broken. The parade was the answer. The planning began long before the prisoners entered the capital. Orders were issued through the NKVD to transport the captured Germans from camps to Moscow. The logistics were staggering. Tens of thousands of men had to be guarded, clothed in whatever remained of their tattered uniforms, and arranged into disciplined columns that could walk without collapsing. Stalin insisted the march must show the Germans as defeated, but not destroyed, stripped of pride, but alive enough to serve as a living monument to Soviet triumph. Dead enemies could not speak to the world, but humiliated ones could. The route was chosen with deliberate precision. It cut through the heart of Moscow, past landmarks that had become synonymous with Soviet resilience. The wide boulevards that had once trembled with the fear of air raids were now stages for a different kind of war. Along the sidewalks, soldiers who had fought at the front mingled with factory workers who had labored day and night to supply the war effort. Mothers who had buried sons stood next to children who had known nothing but war. The presence of foreign journalists was ensured. Invitations were extended, access granted, because Stalin understood that images mattered more than words. Photographs and reports would cross oceans and borders, carrying Moscow's silent message to Berlin, London, and Washington. The very name given to the event, the March of the Vanquished, was itself a weapon. It framed the narrative before a single prisoner set foot on the cobblestones. This was not just a display of captives. It was a procession of defeat, a rolling funeral for Hitler's ambitions in the East. Soviet propaganda emphasized this relentlessly. Newspapers prepared articles in advance, editors sharpened headlines, and radio stations braced to spread the word across the Union. The mighty Wehrmacht had been brought low, not on distant battlefields, but here under the eyes of Moscow's citizens. The effect was profound. To the Soviet people, starved of good news during years of tragedy, this was proof incarnate. No longer abstract reports from the front, no longer rumors whispered in breadlines. This was flesh and blood evidence that their sacrifices had meaning. Every widow who stood along the parade route could look at the hollow faces of the prisoners and see vengeance made visible. Every soldier recovering from wounds could see his suffering repaid in humiliation. And every child could learn that the nightmare that had begun with German tanks rolling across the border could end with those same Germans walking in chains. Stalin knew that the war was fought not only on fields of mud and snow, but in the souls of his people. He needed them to believe in victory as much as his soldiers needed food and ammunition. But the message extended beyond the Soviet Union's borders. Stalin was ever conscious of his allies. In 1944, relations with Britain and the United States were strained by mistrust. Churchill and Roosevelt respected the Red Army's sacrifices, but feared Stalin's ambitions. By staging the parade in front of foreign correspondents, Stalin was sending a carefully crafted image. The Soviet Union was not merely surviving, it was crushing the Nazi war machine. It was a signal that Moscow had borne the heaviest burden and that its victories would shape the post-war world. The photographs of endless German columns would remind London and Washington that their Eastern ally was indispensable, and that the Red Army had done what no other force had achieved. It had shattered the core of Hitler's armies. For the Germans, the parade was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Soldiers who had once marched through conquered capitals now found themselves paraded like cattle in front of the enemy's civilians. Hitler's propaganda had promised them supremacy, had painted the Slavs as subhuman, incapable of defeating the master race. But here, in the heart of Moscow, the lie was exposed in the most brutal way possible. There was no cheering crowd to greet them, no songs, no flowers, only the cold, relentless silence of those they had once scorned. Stalin understood that this humiliation would travel back to Germany itself, whispered among prisoners, carried in photographs. Gnawing at the illusion of Nazi invincibility, the silence itself was not accidental. Stalin ordered it explicitly. There would be no jeering mobs, no stones thrown, no angry outbursts from the crowd. Such displays would humanize the Germans, reduce the clarity of the spectacle. Silence, on the other hand, stripped the moment of any distraction. The contrast was striking. Where Soviet parades were filled with music and banners, this march was marked only by the sound of boots against stone. The absence of noise became its own kind of roar, a void that crushed the prisoners' dignity more effectively than shouts ever could. Every step they took echoed through the city, a drumbeat of defeat amplified by the stillness around them. Foreign journalists struggled to describe it. Some compared it to the Roman tradition of triumphs, where defeated enemies were paraded before the victors. But this was darker, more chilling. The Romans had celebrated their triumphs with laughter and revelry. Moscow's parade was drenched in silence, as if the entire city was holding its breath. Reporters scribbled notes describing the hollow faces of the Germans, the grim stares of the civilians, the strange atmosphere of revenge carried out without a single word. Their photographs, later published in newspapers around the world, became some of the most iconic images of the war, testaments not just to Soviet victory, but to the psychological mastery of its leader. For Stalin, the spectacle had multiple layers of meaning. It was a message to his people: your sacrifices have not been in vain. It was a message to his allies: the Soviet Union bears the brunt of this war and deserves its seat at the table of victory. And it was a message to Germany: your destiny is humiliation, your soldiers nothing but fodder for our history books. Each layer worked in concert, creating an event that was more than the sum of its parts. Even after the prisoners had passed, the planning continued to reveal itself. The water trucks that rolled out immediately afterward were not merely practical, they were symbolic. The streets were washed clean, as though Moscow itself was erasing the stain of the invaders. This final act was a stroke of genius in propaganda terms. To the people of Moscow, it was catharsis made literal. The enemy had been paraded, then washed away. To the wider world, it was a metaphor for what the Red Army promised to do to Europe itself: sweep away Nazism until nothing remained but clean streets and quiet cities. And yet, beneath the grandeur of Stalin's vision, there was an undercurrent of unease. Some Soviet citizens could not help but see in the prisoners' faces the same exhaustion they felt in their own. Hunger, fatigue, and despair were not foreign to Moscow's people. They lived with them daily. For a fleeting moment, a few may have felt pity, but pity was not permitted, not in the narrative Stalin crafted. The silence was not only for the Germans, it was for the Soviets themselves, a command to bury compassion, to replace it with cold detachment. Stalin's propaganda machine demanded unity. demanded that the spectacle be remembered not as a tragedy of humanity, but as a triumph of the state. History would remember the event as one of the greatest propaganda spectacles of the war. It achieved its purpose flawlessly. For weeks afterward, Soviet newspapers reprinted photographs emphasizing the magnitude of the prisoners' humiliation. Abroad, headlines spoke of the Wehrmacht's broken spirit, of the Soviet Union's unstoppable advance. In Berlin, whispers spread among civilians who saw the images. If 57,000 could be paraded in Moscow, how many more had fallen? The psychological blow was devastating. Stalin had wielded the parade as both a scalpel and a hammer. It cut into the morale of his enemies while striking with blunt force across the consciousness of his people and allies. It was not merely the march of prisoners. It was a weaponized performance, a silent opera of humiliation choreographed for maximum impact. The Germans walked through Moscow as defeated men, but in truth, they were actors in Stalin's grand play. A play written not on a stage, but across the wide avenues of a city that had once stood on the brink of destruction. When the last of the German prisoners finally shuffled past the great avenues of Moscow, the city exhaled as if it had been holding its breath for hours. The streets, once thrumming with the sound of boots and the murmurs of a silent, watchful crowd, now seemed to sag under the weight of what had been witnessed. Children, who had stood wide-eyed along the sidewalks for hours, could finally blink and look around, trying to process a scene that felt both real and unreal, like something lifted from a story their parents had warned them about. Mothers, who had clutched their children's hands so tightly that the knuckles turned white, released them slowly, as if afraid that letting go too soon might undo the truth of what had occurred. The long, hot day had not only paraded men in defeat, it had paraded the memories, the pain, and the endurance of an entire people. Water trucks rumbled into the city, hosing down the cobblestones, washing away the dirt, dust, and sweat left by the soldiers' endless steps. The streets sparkled briefly under the sun, the reflection a stark contrast to the grim reality of hours before. But this cleansing was far from mere sanitation. It was deliberate symbolism, orchestrated down to the smallest detail. As the water ran in rivulets along the gutters, the citizens of Moscow could see in that act a metaphor for the war itself. The enemies of the state had been paraded, exposed, and humiliated. Now the city itself could wash away the imprint of terror, the residue of violence, and the traces of the invaders who had once dared to dream of conquering the Soviet heartland. There was a sense of catharsis that mingled with fatigue, a bitter, heavy satisfaction that was both communal and intensely private. For the prisoners, the day had been more than humiliation. It had been a psychological crucible. Weeks of hunger, fear, and defeat had culminated in this relentless public display. Some walked with their heads bowed, eyes fixed on the ground, as if the cobblestones themselves had the power to swallow them whole. Others glanced at the silent faces of the crowd, searching for an ounce of mercy or recognition that never came. They were stripped not only of pride, but of agency. Each step taken was imposed, measured, and observed. Their commanders, their former hierarchies, had vanished into irrelevance, leaving them as mere instruments of the Soviet message. The psychological impact extended far beyond the prisoners themselves. To the citizens of Moscow, the day was a living lesson in power, justice, and survival. Many remembered vividly what the German army had wrought in villages across the Soviet Union. Towns burned, crops seized, families annihilated. Now, seeing those same men broken and obedient, people felt a profound, almost spiritual vindication. But this was not the shallow joy of revenge. It was something deeper, more elemental. It was recognition that suffering had a purpose, that resilience mattered, and that even the most fearsome of enemies could be brought to heel through the combination of courage, endurance, and unyielding strategy. As the crowds dispersed, conversations hummed in quiet tones. Some spoke of the planning that must have gone into such a spectacle, marveling at the scale, the precision, and the thought behind every detail. Others focused on what they had seen etched into the soldiers' faces: fatigue, fear, resignation. The spectacle had been a reminder of the fragility of power, the ephemerality of pride, and the brutal mathematics of war. Even in defeat, the German soldiers were human enough to evoke a complicated tangle of emotions. Pity, satisfaction, and contemplation mingled together. The impact of the parade extended beyond the psychological and symbolic. It resonated politically as well. Stalin's decision to orchestrate the march in Moscow's heart had been calculated for maximum effect, not just domestically, but internationally. Photographs taken by foreign journalists, images of endless columns of hollow-eyed men moving through a silent city, traveled across borders. Berlin saw them and whispered of collapse. London and Washington understood the potency of the message. The Soviet Union had delivered a blow not only militarily, but morally, psychologically, and symbolically. The defeated soldiers were more than trophies. They were instruments of a carefully choreographed declaration. The tide had turned irrevocably in the east. For the German military command, the parade was a humiliation that reverberated far beyond the streets of Moscow. Soldiers who survived the march carried stories of their public degradation back to POW camps and temporary holding facilities across the Soviet Union. The images, the whispered tales of the silent, relentless columns, and the ceaseless watchfulness of the Moscow populace served as a constant reminder of defeat. Hitler's propaganda machine, which had spent years instilling visions of invincibility, could not erase the mental scars inflicted by a city's quiet judgment. Yet the parade was also a moment that crystallized the resilience of the Soviet people. They had suffered unimaginable hardships: hunger, occupation, bombardment, the loss of loved ones, and yet they had endured. This day was proof, visible proof, that suffering had not been in vain. The city itself had become an instrument of justice, and in its streets ordinary citizens had witnessed history in motion. There was no fanfare, no parade music, no triumphant shouts, only the rhythm of boots and the quiet contemplation of those who had survived. And in that quiet, the magnitude of their collective endurance became almost sacred, as if the city itself was both witness and participant in a great act of historical reckoning. The prisoners themselves would never forget the day. Many would carry the memory to the end of their lives. The long columns, the unyielding eyes of the citizens, the quiet streets of Moscow, polished clean afterward, as though to erase both shame and evidence simultaneously. Some wrote in later memoirs that it was a humiliation more profound than any battlefield defeat. Others recounted the uncanny silence, how the absence of noise amplified the weight of every step they took. It was a parade not of victory, but of psychological mastery, a demonstration that power could be exercised with subtlety as sharp as a blade. For the people of Moscow, the march offered closure, a ritual of sorts. For the collective trauma endured since the beginning of the war, witnessing the humiliation of the invaders allowed them to release, at least temporarily, the immense grief and rage that had accumulated over years. They felt a sense of justice, one that could not be delivered in a courtroom or on a battlefield alone. History in that moment had been made visible. The mighty could fall, the oppressors could be humbled, and the city that had once teetered on the brink of destruction could assert itself in quiet dignity as triumphant. In the months that followed, the parade remained etched in the memories of all who had witnessed it. Its images became iconic, reproduced in newspapers, journals, and propaganda materials throughout the Soviet Union and beyond. The significance was clear. Moscow had staged a demonstration not just of military might, but of moral and psychological superiority. It was proof that the Red Army could break the pride of the invader without firing a single shot on that particular day. The city had become a stage, the prisoners actors, and the silent crowd an audience that participated in history itself. Ultimately, the parade was a prelude to the final chapters of World War II in Europe. Less than a year later, the Red Army would reach Berlin, carrying forward the momentum, strategy, and psychological mastery displayed in Moscow. The 57,000 German soldiers paraded through the streets were both a symbol and a warning. Defeat could be as public and unyielding as victory was private and celebrated. The city's streets, washed clean afterward, remained a testament to human endurance, calculated planning, and the power of symbolism in the theatre of war. In the end, July 17, 1944, would stand as a day when humiliation was wielded with precision, and when the collective memory of a people was marked by both sorrow and satisfaction, a day when the past and the future converged on Moscow's cobblestones.